Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce John Drew, who is our plenary session speaker tonight. Now, John, we just want to get a little chance to get to know you. I am impressed by your title. Director of Staff Experience and Engagement in the NHS. Please, tell us what that means. I might be the only one who doesn't know.
Yeah, well, it's a dangerous title, isn't it? Because if you tell anyone, they straight away will tell you a story of their unhappiness and expect me to fix it personally quickly. But the job is, well, my job has changed recently, so let me answer your question and then I'll tell you what it is now. So Director of Staff Experience and Engagement is a national role in NHS England in the people function, essentially. And a large part of my job is looking after the way we listen to staff, so the annual staff survey that I'm sure you all complete. About 650,000 people do, which makes it, I think, the biggest staff survey in the world. I don't think the Chinese army has a staff survey, otherwise they might beat it. There's other ways we listen as well, obviously, but that's a key way. The development of staff networks, which I might refer to in what I say. I also was leading the National Health and Wellbeing team, which became pretty important, obviously, during the pandemic. And a lot of work has been done at the national level there. And then I pick up other things along the way, including the workforce aspects of elective recovery, how we can make sure that we are doing all we can to have the workforce needed to support what is a pretty big task, as you will know. But then NHS England, as it does from time to time, has been restructuring for a long time. And as a result of that, 2 weeks ago, I started a new job, which is in the Midlands region of NHS England as Director of Workforce Training and Education. So it's still in the same kind of territory of people, but a broader role in the region.
Oh, still sounds good though.
It still means lots of people will come up to me and say, why haven't you fixed it yet?
Oh, I was just about to tell you my problems, but okay. Now, of course, you haven't always been in the NHS. You've got an interesting, what you've done before, really. And tell us a bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. So I sometimes trace it back to the fact that my dad trained as an engineer, my mum trained as a midwife, and I feel that, and then actually retrained subsequently to be a vicar in the Church of England. So somehow all of those strands, I think, have fed into this area of interest, really, which is kind of understanding and trying to improve organisations. So if you see a bruise on my forehead, it's where I've been banging my head against a brick wall for several years. But really wanting to see the NHS change, I suppose, and for it to be properly recognised that it's a people organisation. But I think there are spiritual dimensions to all of that work too. My training originally was as a manufacturing engineer, and then I worked in industry and then in consulting for a while and joined the NHS about 7 years ago. And going now through the sort of accelerated ageing process of a leadership role in the NHS.
Oh. Well, it's great to have you here tonight. And when we first talked about this plenary session and about sort of what are the kind of things that we as a weary workforce in the NHS might need to be hearing, what were the things that you thought were really struck you with your experience in your job that we might need to be hearing tonight?
Yeah, well, I'm sure you wouldn't expect someone from NHS England to give you all the answers, or at least if I tried, they might not resonate. So, I mean, I'm going to share, I guess, the kind of things that I've wrestled with in reflecting on kind of my working life and the job I do now. I think to believe that God's in charge, which the other talks this week have really emphasised, and that we have access to a power that's bigger than it all, really, which is why this song was great. Because it's kind of not about us, thankfully. But how do we integrate our faith in practice into our work rather than sort of have it as a sideshow? And also, I guess I really want to encourage you, even if you are going through a really difficult time. I mean, I want you to know that I've also been through a very difficult time at various points in the NHS. I would say as low as I've been, probably. So I know it can be really tough, but equally, I think that in my case, I would be able to testify now to how that was a period of growth in the end, and kind of being part of the process of being emptied means that I think I can be more effective as a channel now, because a channel needs to be empty to work. So I kind of want to try and get the right balance between recognizing it's really tough, but not sending you home all feeling thoroughly depressed, but actually believing that there are real opportunities and they're God-given opportunities. The Bible says he prepares good works in advance for us to do. And I think we need to recognize them when they come and be bold. And I think there are various reasons why that might be becoming easier, actually, to be bold at least. So those are the kind of, that's the short version of what I'll hopefully unpack in a bit longer in the talk.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. We're looking very much forward to that. Give us a chance to just be encouraged, to lift our eyes again. So I will leave you to continue the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Felicia. And thank you for inviting me. I know you probably all didn't, but I'm not a doctor, a nurse, a midwife, a physio, or anything else. I'm just a lowly manager and an engineer. So it's really great to be invited in. And I'm so impressed that you're all here after a long day when you could be having a snooze or whatever else it might be. So I'm going to talk about 3 things, and then probably for about 10 minutes each. And then after each of these, I'm going to give 5 minutes for you to have a conversation with the person next to you. So hopefully that doesn't make you too anxious. You might be married to that person, you might not know that person, but I'm going to give you some questions that you can use or not use just to have a short chat for 2 or 3 minutes each, really, to reflect on what we've covered in that first block, and then we'll move on to the next, okay? And I think your conversations might be more important, frankly, than what I have to say, but let's hope that and pray that God moves and speaks through all of this. So the first topic really is dealing with pressure, recognizing that health systems everywhere actually are under pressure. It's not just the NHS, not unique to this country. But it's actually not organizations that feel pressure, it's the people that work within them. So I think I want to recognize that, the reality that we start with. I want to then talk about the importance of staying connected, primarily being connected to Jesus, but also being actually connected with each other. And you come together to do that here, but how do we maintain that sense of connection with other believers during the course of our everyday work? And then thirdly, the consequence of that, I would say, is that we will bear fruit. And Jesus said, by your fruits you will know them. I think in my experience, and I suppose my approach with regards to my faith in the workplace, is to make sure people know I'm a Christian, but then not necessarily talk about it much, but try and behave in a way that bears the Father's likeness, which is obviously difficult because we're limited, but do my best to do that, and then see what happens really, and hopefully that will lead to opportunities and conversations. So, but we'll talk about what it means to bear fruit, even when the conditions aren't ideal for bearing fruit, because it depends on things like the weather, doesn't it, and the conditions. So that's what we're covering. Hopefully that's okay. If you don't like the look of that, you can leave now. But so I bet you didn't expect me to start here. My first job after leaving university was with a packaging company, which at the time was called Metal Box. And part of my job was working on a manufacturing line that made Fray Bentos cans. So can you put your hand up if you've eaten a Fray Bentos pie? I suspect it's a bit of a generational thing. If you're a digital native, you might not know what one is. But if you like Fray Bentos, so the key thing it says on the picture is you need to remove the lid, and then you actually put the tin in the oven, and it's surprisingly good. I found out when I was looking for this picture that actually the late Queen was a fan of Fray Bentos pies, and apparently used to request for them to be served on her aeroplane when she was traveling. So that's one thing that you didn't know, I suspect, when you came in this evening. So why am I telling you all this, you might be wondering. The way you make this can is that you put a really thin sheet of metal into a press, and the metal is printed in advance, and then the press closes on the metal, pushes it into a mold, and lo and behold, a pie can emerges. And actually what's really clever is that they print it in a distorted way so that by the time it's been through the press, it's all correctly printed straight. But the point being that the metal doesn't really stand a chance, does it? When a press pushes down with like 50 tons of pressure, it's inevitable that what will come out is, something the shape of the mold. And Paul, I don't think, knew a lot about Fray Bentos pies, but he understood this concept because this is a great passage that I'm sure you know in Romans 12. He says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." So that first part is a bit of a reminder for me that actually our work is a form of worship, and it's probably the thing the act of worship we spend most time doing. I know it doesn't always feel like an act of worship, but it is. And then he says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world." And the Greek word there is about being pushed into a mold. So he's saying, don't conform to the pattern of this world. He's assuming that there is a pattern. If you think about the Romans, then the pressures on them probably were much more severe with more immediate life or death consequences than they might be for us now. Don't conform to the pattern of this world, but instead be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And if that happens, we'll be able to test and approve God's will, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Queen sang a song, didn't they, called Under Pressure? And it starts by saying, "Pressure pushing down on me, pressing down on you." So that's something that we kind of all understand, this notion of pressure. And I wonder, what are the forces acting on you? Where does the pressure come from? I've been to a few seminars that have mentioned things like our upbringing, our parents, our role models, our peers. Peer pressure isn't just for teenagers. Peer pressure acts on all of us, I would say. It could actually be the pressure comes from within ourselves. It could be the pressure comes from work. Things like, constant government announcements about pinning re-election hopes on reducing the NHS waiting list. That brings pressure that cascades all the way through. And then what's the mold? So what's the kind of thing that the shape that's kind of pressing you into? Paul assumes that all of that is true, that there is a pressure to conform to the pattern, but then he says, be transformed instead. So if you understand the physics of the pie can, you need something with a greater force to resist conforming. And that's the power of God, that's the Holy Spirit working within us. It's not just positive thinking. Positive thinking actually has a role. The way we think and frame the issues that we're dealing with is surprisingly powerful, I would say. But fundamentally, there's a greater power that we have access to, which is the Holy Spirit working within us. So the message in kind of cooking terms is, be less like a pie and more like a souffle. The message translates that second verse in a really nice way. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. So you might not feel there's all that pressure acting on you. You might just found you've taken on the shape of the pie can without noticing it. Instead, fix your attention on God and you'll be changed from the inside out. So that's, I think, an important thing for us to remind ourselves of when we're dealing with pressure is, yes, there is a lot of pressure, but there's a few things we can do in response to that. One thing is think about how we frame it, but the other thing is invite the Holy Spirit in and expect to be transformed in a way there that says from the inside out. I love these films, do you? The kind of Wallace and Gromit stables. So this is some images from Chicken Run, continuing the pie theme, which will drop shortly, I can promise you. There's a very profound line spoken in this by Babs the chicken, who says, "But I don't want to be a pie. I don't like gravy." And then at the end, you can see that, you know the story, that they infiltrate the sort of pie factory that's run on the grounds of the lines of a concentration camp, and it all goes a bit wrong, and the gravy pressure's building. And it feels a little bit like that's kind of happening in the NHS at the moment. And one of the things that I suppose I want to draw attention to is the fact that often organisations are compared to machines. And I think that's quite a dangerous error, really, because we then start to use language and thinking that carries the metaphor of a machine into an organisation, which is actually more like a living system, I would say. It's more like a series of interconnected teams, for example, in the delivery of healthcare. So we talk about things like spans of control and key performance indicators and dashboards, which is kind of having been a management consultant, that's kind of what we're brought up to think, if you like. But the consequences of that can be, with my staff experience and engagement hat on, that we end up with a workforce that sort of says, well, I'll tell you what, if you think of me as a component in a machine, that's kind of how I'll end up behaving and feeling. So you lose a lot of discretionary effort, motivation, energy, which is what we need to make the whole endeavour work. I just also want to mention, and then I'll let you have the first conversation, that Paul, who said, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, he didn't just sort of advocate it, he did it. If you remember in Philippians, he basically lists his CV, pretty much. He says, I was a devout Jew, I was from this tribe, I had this kind of training, and then he ends that list by saying, as for righteousness, I was faultless, which is a pretty strong statement, I would say. And of course, he was persecuting Christians because of it, so he was deeply religious. And then he says, but I consider all of that rubbish, and the word for rubbish is really strong. It's a word that you probably shouldn't use in company like this, but it's like dung, or it's something that stinks and is horrible. So all the things that he'd spent his life working for, he now recognizes are rubbish compared to Christ. So he basically trades the whole lot in order to gain Christ. And so for me, the message there is kind of how do we see ourselves? You've all worked hard to get qualifications, for example, so you could do an equivalent list to Paul's. And those are good things because they qualify you for what you do. But we can kind of hold on to them too tightly. And for me, there's a really strong message, like with the way the Israelites collected manna. They were asked to collect daily bread, but if they hung on to it, it started to stink and went moldy, basically. So there's something I think quite important for us, which is that even good things, if we hold on to them, kind of lose their power and effect. And we need to be more like the boy in the feeding of the 5,000 that says, this is all I've got, but I'm going to give it to you, Jesus. And he has the power to basically multiply it. So I think that's how we're encouraged to use our gifts and talents. It's not, the song we just sang, it's not all on us to do. It's Christ in us. But we have to be willing to kind of let go and give up in order to make that happen. So let's move on to the next section, really, which is about being connected. And the passage I'm going to talk about here, I guess it's fairly obvious, is John 15. These are all passages from the Bible that have meant a lot to me over the years. There was a particular day when I was a teenager when I walked along and read the whole of John 14 to 17 in one go, which is Jesus' basically his final words to his disciples. And it was just very powerful, actually. And the message of this passage, which I'll share with us, remind us of really, is very powerful. When I was looking for a graphic and Googling, you can see how I spend my time. This image came up, which is a thing called the Grapevine. I didn't know about this. Another piece of trivia you'll get from this evening, which is at Hampton Court. And the vine, a single plant, is 250 years old, and it fills the greenhouse. In fact, during the course, so it was planted during the time of Capability Brown, who was, sweeping away formal gardens and going back to nature, etc. The greenhouse has been outgrown 5 times, and the last time, which was I think in 1970, they built a new greenhouse over the old one. So, I mean, you get the picture, really, that it was so prolific that Queen Victoria used to get grapes from Hampton Court delivered to Windsor and Osborne House in the Isle of Wight. And in the year 2001, it produced a harvest of 400 kilos. So it's pretty prolific. That's one plant. And it says there, the largest grapevine in the world, and I kind of thought they obviously haven't read John 15, because actually, we know that the largest vine in the world is the one that Jesus planted, and it now has about 2.3 billion people in it. So I don't want to sound smug or anything, but... So Jesus said, I am the true vine and my Father's the gardener. That's like I think this in 2 sentences is a bit of an example to the NHS of how to write strategy documents, to be honest. So the first sentence pretty much covers this is the purpose of the thing. And then the second is like the operating model. So the gardener, that's God the Father, cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. So, I mean, that's a pretty amazing summary of basically the strategy for the growth of Christianity and the church through history, isn't it? That Jesus is the vine, so this is an organization as a living thing, it's not like a machine. The Father is the gardener, and the gardener pretty much has one job on his mind, which is fruit. And that means that if a branch isn't bearing fruit, it's actually removed. But quite interestingly, even if a branch is bearing fruit, it gets pruned. So that we'll come back to, because pruning isn't necessarily a great process if you're a branch, I guess. Certainly, my experience is that if you're being pruned, it's not great. But actually, the purpose is that God the Father knows what he's doing and wants the vine to be more fruitful. And then, so that pretty much sums up what we're aiming for. And then Jesus then explains to his disciples, so what is our part in this? And the answer is our job is to remain in him. That's pretty much it. He says, remain in me also, as I also remain in you. And then kind of stating the obvious, but there's quite a lot of humor, I think, in what Jesus says. I mean, I can't believe he could attract crowds of thousands of people if he wasn't entertaining. So he says, no branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. But my experience is that I can try quite hard to bear fruit by myself. And I wonder sometimes whether even when the fruit appears, we sort of say, look at me, I'm a branch, aren't I fruitful? Rather than all I did was stay connected to the vine. So the song again we've just sung was all about, essentially, if we get this right, it's the gardener that gets the glory, which is how it should be. I'm the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. I mean, that's kind of a promise, isn't it? If we do that, remain in him, we will be fruitful, but a reminder that apart from me, you can do nothing. And I think part of the challenge of being talented people, which actually, I mean, the NHS, let's remind ourselves, is an incredibly talented workforce. In terms of the collective education and endeavour that's gone into training 1.5 million people, that's just in England. So, 2 million people or whatever in the UK is massive. So this, in a way, your education, a bit like Paul's, encourages you to believe that, you've done this. When we write a CV or we go to an interview, I don't know if it's the same for you, but I've had feedback in interviews, stop saying we, you need to say, I've done this. And I kind of think, well, that's not quite how I see it. But, that's what we're encouraged to do, is to sort of say, look at all the fruit on my bit of on my branch. So this is back to this point that's the pressure to conform to the pattern of this world, and we're being asked to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, to think about things a different way, which is that my job is to be connected to Jesus. And so there's kind of 2 layers going on. There's your day job, what you do in healthcare in the NHS, which is very, very important, you're trained for, and then there's also your job as a Christian, which is to stay connected to Jesus. And I would extend this a bit and say, if you look at the vine, it's also to be connected to other Christians. And I'm going to lean on the authority of Alistair Fife, who ran an excellent session earlier on prayer, and he challenged us and said, if you're not meeting with other Christians, why not? So you are meeting with other Christians here, but my observation would be there's a moment now in the NHS, partly actually because of the emphasis on equality, diversity and inclusion. There are 9 protected characteristics in law, and one of them is faith or religion. So actually now is a great time to be establishing or part of a Christian staff network or a faith network, because it's being actively encouraged. And I know from looking after the staff survey that the majority of people that work in the NHS declare a religion when they complete the staff survey. So we might be hearing like 3 to 5% of people go to church. Actually, more than 50% of people declare a religion, and most of them say Christian. So we could debate what that means, but they could say, I'd rather not say, and they could say no religion. And when you analyse the data, the people that declare a religion are more engaged than the people that don't. So there's something, I think it's easy to have this narrative that we're constantly swimming against the current, and I think it can feel like that. But I think we need to recognise where there are opportunities, and I think there is an opportunity right now in this space to be part of or establish. It doesn't have to be a formal staff network, but they are, organisations are asked to create those. So it's quite difficult for your organisation to say no if you propose it. It could be as simple as praying with other Christians. But I would encourage you to try and weave this into your everyday work, as well as be part of CMF and other things. And by the way, when in the session earlier that I referred to, that Alistair ran, he encouraged us to reflect on different passages on a kind of make a choice. And I looked at John 15, and even having prepared this, there's a verse I haven't picked out which says, "This is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples." So it's just a real reminder that if we're fruitful, that shows that we're his disciples, and it gives glory to God. And that may not involve saying much about what we believe, but it involves actions speaking louder than words and our behaviour, and I'll come back to that in the next section. A few years ago, we went on a family holiday to the Azores, which, if you're thinking that's a really sunny island with lots of beaches and maybe you should go there, I need to let you know that it's in the middle of the Atlantic and it's actually quite wet. But it's very beautiful. And one of the things we found on a walk is these channels. And that's because there's quite a lot of rain at times anyway in the Azores, and it fills up a lake at the top of a mountain. And then what's happened over the years is people have built these channels. You can't really tell, but they're about 6 feet deep. And they run for a long, long way. And obviously what that does is it gets the water from the source to where it's needed to kind of grow things and be useful. And to get there, you can see it basically hugs the mountain. It's like a canal that follows the contours. And I kind of think this is potentially a metaphor for our role, which is that we're often encouraged to believe that developing in our careers means going higher somehow. But actually this would tell me that sometimes our job is simply to be the channel that connects the source of blessing, which is Jesus, to the people that need it. And interestingly, I know that there's the view of leadership that was being discussed earlier is people in senior leadership roles for that leadership network, but we're absolutely all leaders, because leaders are people that influence the behavior of others, I would say. So whatever role you're in, you can be a channel, but part of being a channel is this idea of remaining in Jesus and being open. And sometimes there are things that block the channel, and the pruning process, to mix metaphors, is partly, I think, about unblocking the channel. And sometimes when the gardener knows what he's doing, that's the cause of difficulties we go through, actually, I think, is to be more fruitful and to become more open, more reliant on God. So I want to encourage you also, if you're perhaps feeling a bit stuck, is maybe God's put you where you are for a reason, and actually just being a channel of God's blessing to other people through the way you behave. I'll come back to say a bit more about that in the next section. Could be really, really powerful and a source of blessing to others. So let's just go back to John 15. Jesus goes on to basically explain this is all about love. You know, if you think about the vine, what's flowing through its xylem tubes or whatever it is, in the case of the vine that Jesus is describing, it's love. That's what we're asked to flow, to stay connected to. Remain in my love. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you, which is, by the way, with a sacrificial love. Greater love has no one to lay down his friends. This is just a bit of bonus material, but it's always struck me, this next bit, that we emphasize often, particularly as kind of evangelical Christians, that we've made a decision to follow Jesus, which I think we have. But actually, Jesus also said, in the bigger picture, you didn't choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed you so that you may go and bear fruit. That's actually quite a powerful framing, isn't it? So Jesus has chosen us to be part of the vine, to be fruitful. Kind of pretty simple, but a different framing perhaps of what we're here for. And hopefully you can balance this a bit against the experience and the challenges of the day job, because I think there's real opportunities here as well. And I would want you to see those and be bold. And I want to encourage you in your jobs and workplace to take the opportunities that you have. So we're going to move on to talk about bearing fruit, which is, I've kind of suggested, is almost inevitable if we're doing the thing that we talked about before, which is remaining in Jesus and being connected to the vine. But I guess I also want to acknowledge in this section that this nice little twee picture of the tree with lots of lovely butterflies and bees and stuff doesn't always feel quite like that. Jesus sat under a fig tree that had no fruit and got quite angry about it, because as far as he's concerned, the purpose of a fruit tree is to bear fruit. And sometimes we don't feel very fruitful, and we can feel like it hasn't, we haven't really had the conditions to produce fruit for quite a long time. So I want to try and address the current reality for some people, that it may not feel this way, but also, the Bible is about truth and promises, so we need to kind of understand both. I think you all know this from Galatians. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Interestingly, by the way, against such things there is no law. So quite a lot of the framing of what's out there in the stalls is kind of about how do we as Christians live given the changing legal, ethical, social framework. This guidance suggests that actually just bearing fruit will always get through. There's no law against being kind yet. Let's hope that doesn't come in next. So if you're maybe mathematically inclined, when I see this, and it helps me to remember them, there's 3 sets of 3 fruits. And the first set of 3 has 1 syllable each, and the second set of 3 has 2 syllables each, and the third set of 3 has 3 syllables each. You're going to win a lot of pub quizzes now. And so the one bang in the middle is kindness. And I guess that's, it's interesting to me that there's quite a movement now in the NHS. This isn't the only example of it, but a guy called Tim Keogh, who I've met actually, he's been really effective at bringing a message to the NHS of kindness. And he's done quite a lot of work with staff groups to say, what does a good day look like for you and what does a bad day look like? And quite often a bad day involves essentially an unkind word or interaction, which is also, the Bible knows this. James talks about how a forest can be set on fire by a small spark, and basically the tongue is like a fire, so it can be very destructive. So a really small interaction can demolish people, essentially, but if we're methodical about encouraging people, we can build them up. Unfortunately, that's an unequal equation in the sense that you have to embed the habit of kindness to overcome unkindness. There's other work done that you probably know of called Civility Saves Lives, is it, I think? Yeah, to say essentially if this kind of thing goes wrong in, let's say, an operating theatre, people are distracted, quite bad things could happen. So I also want to recognise, I guess, and encourage you with the fact that something's changing, I think, in the NHS, that there is a lot of recognition, by the way, coming from staff more, this thing about kindness, very bottom up, but also one of the things that we did in 2021 when we refreshed the staff survey is, with the advice of people like Professor Michael West, embedded some new questions about the behaviours that you should expect of your line manager. And if you all complete the staff survey, you'll know that one of them says, for example, my manager encourages me at work. Another one says, my manager listens to me when I want to express concerns. So that's good. I think we would say, well, if we all behave more like that, life would be better. And I think it's very consistent with these fruits. But So it doesn't always feel like this, and I guess I want to say a little bit about why I think that is. Compassion is a word that is freely used in the NHS. I think most organisations would have it in their mission statements or their values. And I looked up the definition of this, kind of knowing the answer, but there's one here from a thing called the Cambridge Dictionary, which says, compassion is a strong feeling of sympathy and sadness for the suffering or bad luck of others and a wish to help them. Which strikes me as a little bit of a definition of the spirit of the age, to be honest. It all sounds a bit kind of fluffy, like we're going to express sympathy or sadness. The actual root of the word is unfortunately not quite as fluffy. It's the idea of suffering together. And I think this is at the heart of why it feels hard at the moment. This has kind of always been true, but the NHS deals with suffering, essentially. It deals with people that are very anxious, ill, scared, suffering. A reminder that in Revelation we're told that we won't need the NHS one day, so good thing we've all got pensions and stuff, but there'll come a point where there'll be no more sadness or pain or death. But when we suffer with other people, it empties our tank, essentially. Michael West is also very good on this, and we need to replenish ourselves somehow. So this is back to this point about being connected to the source. Is from Jesus, there's an unlimited supply of love, essentially, and that love can then overflow to others. And I think the sad thing, in a way, is the more you care, the more it hurts, doesn't it? A good way of not emptying your tank is to be really cynical. And I've worked with people like that, and it's not great, honestly. But there's something here about the honest truth of why it's hard and tiring. And it's not just about NHS funding, I suppose I'm saying. There's something intrinsic in the work. And Paul, who has the answer to most things, doesn't he, talks about, in a way that is pretty uncomfortable, we should glory in our sufferings. So this is a bit of a tough message, but the reason he says that is that there's a kind of virtuous cycle, which is probably the pruning process of the gardener, that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. So I think we could all buy the idea that we need more hope, but I'm not sure we'd sign up for more suffering. But the truth of it is that they often, but not always, go together. So there's something about how do we interpret our experience when we're going through a difficult time. And I feel this all fits together with the earlier passages. Hope doesn't put us to shame because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit, which has been given to us. So that's the transforming power. And then the love that's poured into our hearts overflows to others through the distribution system of the vine. So a bit of personal testimony, and then we'll have one last conversation. So a few years ago, I read this book called The J-Curve. Has anyone read this? No? Oh, great. I think there's something about the mathematician in me that appeals here, because he basically says that the Christian life is a bit like the graphical shape of the J-curve, J for Jesus. So the way it works is that we die. So Jesus went through this cycle. Obviously, he came into earth as a person, and then he died. That's the kind of low point. At the low point, he's emptied. He says on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? But obviously, we wouldn't be here if it had ended that way. What happens then is we rise. So Jesus was resurrected and ended up higher than the point at which he started. So he argues in this book, I'm saving you reading it, by the way, that this basic pattern recurs through life, that we should expect that if we follow Jesus, he says, take up your cross and follow me, we will go through this cycle. And when we're at the bottom point, it's pretty awful. I have a Morris Minor pickup, which is the same age as me. And when I change the oil, this is a bit like a Fray Bentos moment. Lots of people will think, change the oil. There's a screw underneath in the sump, and you run the engine first to get it warm, and then you undo the screw and the oil drains out. And usually I don't get my hand out of the way quick enough, and the oil kind of pours over my hand, and it's warm.
And it's always felt to me a bit like this is Peter the Pickup, he's called, for reasons I can explain later, that it's like his blood draining away. And that's kind of the process, obviously, that Jesus went through on the cross, is his lifeblood drained away. In the case of the car, you do that because then you put in fresh oil and then it's a whole lot better. It's not a good idea just to add good oil on top of the bad oil. And I think that I feel in my work experience relatively recently, I went through that process where it felt like it all drained away. And I can tell you it was awful. But the effect was, I think, that it created space for God to fill. And there's a very good book about St. John of the Cross. You probably make it sound like I read lots of books. I suppose I do, but you're getting them all at once. Where he kind of says that our job is to create the space for God to fill. And he kind of says that's why cathedrals are big, to get the sense that God's filling them. But the suffering, I think, creates space. It drains us of our ego and ourselves. It makes us empty. And so if you're at the bottom point, a good thing to do is to basically invite God in to fill us up again and maybe replace the bad oil with good oil. A few years ago, I preached in our church on the story of Joseph, and I got my daughter, who's quite artistic, to do these pictures. And you can see basically the story of Joseph is, I'd always thought it's like a series of ups and downs. So you can see that sort of cycle there. You know the story, I won't rehearse it all now, but twice, basically, he's close to death. His brothers chuck him in a pit because he's annoyed them. Potiphar's wife accuses him of something he hasn't done, and he's put in prison. But both of those times, he's kind of restored to a very powerful position. And when I read the book about the J-curve, I thought, well, actually, isn't that what's going on here? That he's going through that kind of cycle. I mean, I don't know what he was thinking when he was thrown into a cistern and then bought by passing people to become a slave. I don't know what he thought when he kind of thought, if I get this interpretation of Pharaoh's dream wrong, I'm basically dead. But in both cases, he was put in a very powerful position, ultimately able to save his people because he was in charge of the food supply while they had a famine. And this is the same basic pattern with Daniel and with Esther. They're implanted into powerful positions for a particular purpose at a particular time. And I think that's true of everyone here. So you may not feel like you're working in a royal palace, but if we believe, as we've been hearing this week, that God is all-powerful, the nations are like a drop in the bucket compared to him. He has a plan, and he's putting us where he needs us to be. And our job is to kind of figure out, so what's he doing that I need to join in with, rather than to sort of try harder by ourselves. And I've felt from my experience at work that this particular reflection was true for me, which is, I do think other people were acting in a way that was intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. So there's a kind of in all of God's economy, there's a kind of recycling process of turning difficulties and bad stuff into something good, which is the J-curve, if that helps you. So to have faith that you'll end up higher than where you started, but probably over time, there'll be another J-curve coming. I suppose you could say, if I'm not experiencing the J-curve, is that a concern? I don't know, to be honest. But I would say that most of us in life at some point experience real suffering. And I think the testimony of most people, and it won't be for everyone, because it may be that it's actually in the next life that it all makes sense, but to trust that God is working his purposes out in how that happens. Let me just recap quickly what we've covered. So on dealing with pressure, we talked about recognizing there is pressure, but don't conform to that pattern. And the way we resist that is not by trying harder, but relying on the Holy Spirit to transform us and our minds, the way we think. And also this idea of give it all up to Jesus, basically. Don't hang on to things, even good things, if we hold on to them, can become difficult. That's part, I guess, of the message of idolatry that we've heard about as well while we've been here. Secondly, that encouragement, it's a bit more than encouragement, really, it's a command, isn't it, of Jesus to be connected. Remain in him, connect to other people, and I would really encourage you to reflect on that and think, how can you do that? And to maybe think, maybe right now there's a moment when it's going to be easier to do that, and we should seize the day. And also the idea of being a channel. We're not just providers of health care or health and care, we're also a channel for God's love in the world, and we can smuggle that in, but it's good for us to do it consciously. And also recognize that that's how we fill our tanks up. We don't just, again, try harder or rest or relax. That's important too, but then we've got access to God's love, and that overflows through us. And then thirdly, bearing fruit. We might have different perspectives on this, but I think there's lots of ways of saying that actions speak louder than words. And if we're nervous about our ability to be explicit about speaking about our faith, then I think the encouragement is that actually the fruit speaks pretty clearly. If people know that you're a person of faith, they'll be watching you very closely. That was a piece of advice from my brother-in-law when I was going through this difficult time, is he said, people will be watching very closely to see how you behave. And basically choosing not to employ the same tactics that I felt were going on around me. So I think that's important, and I've become more and more convinced, to be honest, that kindness is underrated in the workplace. So just be kind. People will really notice that. It will make the world of difference to them, just as it does when people are kind to you. And then I guess this sort of slightly looming message is expect the J curve. So don't be too thrown off when it happens. It won't go on forever. That's the sort of the message that, what goes down must come up. I would say that if there are people here that really do feel at the bottom, I'd be very happy to talk to you or pray with you and try and encourage you, because it's absolutely my testimony that I went through quite a big J curve, and it was pretty horrible at the time. But as I say, I can look back on it now and say, actually, I've grown, and I think I'm better equipped to do what I think God is calling me to do because of it. I'm going to just say a prayer, but it's going to be from the Bible. I mean, one of the great things about preparing this talk is it's all in the Bible, isn't it, really? And it's incredibly up-to-date and current and speaks to our reality, I think. So it's been very helpful for me as well. I say as well. I hope it's been helpful for you. And then after this prayer, the band will come and play a song called Build My Life, which I think actually fits incredibly well with some of these messages. And then I'm going to encourage you, if you don't have to run off, you might just want to pray with the person you've been talking to, just for a minute or two, to commit the conversations you've had to God and invite him into your situations. But here's the prayer. For this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name. I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. And now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work in us, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen.